9/11, Professor James Heckman.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate all those who showed up, some of the newcomers. Okay, so let me summarize what I said last time and show you some evidence and then go through some economic models to try to explain the evidence. One of the key themes, and I only emphasized one aspect of this theme, but the major point was that multiple abilities generate life outcomes through multiple channels. And so just to review the notation that I gave you last time, what I thought about and what I introduced was the notion of human capabilities as predicting outcomes. And so I talked about cognitive capabilities, personal and social skills, and health. Now I made the point which I think is important to make, which is that in fact, separating these components is a lot easier in theory than it is actually in practice, that there actually are some non-trivial identification issues, and I discussed that last time. But from the point of view of this lecture, let me just think of certain measurements on cognition. It turns out that you can actually, if you have one dedicated measurement, one measurement that you really are willing to call cognition, like a Raven's IQ test, that's going to be enough to actually help me identify, even in a non-parametric setting, the underlying capacities. But let me just say, intuitively, I have these capacities, and I'll explain when I use them what's going on. So the crucial thing is that these capacities are explaining outcomes. So if I can see if I can use this, oops, having bad luck today with this. I don't get a pointer. Oh, maybe this is the pointer, yes. So what I have is a set of outcomes where outcomes were indexed by J and the outcomes were at T, and they were a function of all these capabilities plus the effort spent trying to achieve the outcome plus some background or environmental variables. And the effort itself depends on those same background variables and the rewards from the activity. So there definitely are incentive effects built in. And I emphasize that most of the measurements that are used in psychometrics, and a lot of the measurements in the literature, don't standardize for the incentives. So we find serious biases, and I illustrated that with the measurement of IQ, and there are other examples as well. So the key framework is that these capabilities, which I'm using deliberately the language of the capability approach of Sen and Nussbaum, but I'm focusing on human capabilities, things embodied in the agent. So it's not as general a notion of political liberty and so forth as has been developed in that literature. So the key idea, though, is what I call the technology of skill formation. I should say what Flavio Cunha and I call the technology of skill formation. So if you look at this, maybe I can use the pointer here better, that you can see then basically that this technology is showing how capabilities evolve. And a key theme in the literature is whether or not these capabilities are evolving strictly through a biological process, something through some initial conditions, could be biological or social, or whether investment, whether it's schooling, parents, general social interactions, are explaining the evolution. I want to talk about some evidence on this question. And so this was the scheme that I put up last time, and I want to revisit this several times. So we can think of the dynamics of these capabilities as essentially coming out from initial conditions, even prenatal conditions. So the conditions that the mother is treating the child, smoking, drinking, drug use, various kinds of insults that might affect, and we know affect, the actual development of the child. And then a series of investments, I-1, I-0, I-1, up through adulthood, and in fact, even through adulthood. And so the key question is, to what extent and at what stages in the life cycle of individuals can we shape these capabilities? And there are whole different points of view about whether or not these capabilities can be shaped at all and when it's best to do so. And so just anticipating what I want to say, basically what we found from a number of studies, and these are studies that are rooted both in terms of psychological, ordinary developmental studies, as well as neuroscientific studies and studies in epidemiology, suggest very strongly that the early years, prenatal, birth, early childhood, play a very important role, especially in shaping cognition. Cognition is very, very important. For non-cognitive skills, the kind that I talked about last time in great detail, personality skills, there seems to be much more malleability over the life cycle. And in health, it's an open question. Health, we know the bodies can be actually very forgiving. And we know that there can be interventions that can be taken even later in life. So the evidence is less clear. I mean, ideally, if I'd had like 2 or 3 more lectures, I could have given a lecture on measuring health. And there would have been parallel, but it would have been a somewhat shorter lecture because there still is a lot more to be known. And even linking cognitive measurements, non-cognitive measurements in health is a fairly new development. So that was the first point. And I want to go through and try to show you what the evidence is on this. And there is some econometric evidence that has important implications for policy. The second point I made was that the ability gaps, whether they were in cognitive, social and emotional abilities, or in health, they open up very early over the life cycle. And they persist across socioeconomic groups, whether we measure it through the background of the parents, in terms of education or in income, there are some very substantial differences. So I showed you this graph here, which has actually been a powerful piece of evidence, I think, at least for me, looking at this. And there's a lot of earlier stuff that Pedro Carnero and I looked at in the CNLSY data, and it's been affirmed in a number of other recent studies by other people, not just economists, not just people working directly with me, but people in education and so forth. So what you see is this pattern of the cognitive score by maternal education. And so the cognitive score, and these are just basically ranks, if you want to think about it, in the distribution. What you can see, as we showed last time, these cognitive scores are very predictive. They're not totally predictive, but they're very predictive. And these are American data. And the reason why I mention that is that first, there are 2 things about this graph. One is the big difference across children from different educational backgrounds, where their mother has a different level of education. And secondly, that the gaps are largely opening up already by age 5, certainly before kids are opening school. Some would even see age 3. So the gaps are there, and the gaps are there in other dimensions. By the way, it's not just a developed country. There's a parallel kind of graph that I found in Bogota a few months ago when I was there, simply seeing that in one measure of vocabulary score, huge gaps opening up and a parallelism. And though it's been found in many different environments. You get a similar kind of pattern of early emergence of these things in non-cognitive skills. This is a measure of behavioral problems. And this is from a graph with Pedro Carnero. And again, now over a shorter interval, 4 years to 12 years, and not exactly parallel, but with a huge amount of variance. Here, a high score is a bad thing. So you're getting these in inverse order to what I showed with cognitive ability. The higher income kids are showing much better behavior in some sense, self-control, anger management, and the like. And this is the graph I showed on health. And this, although this is American data, something comparable shows up in the Canadian data, and it shows up in the British data as well. So family background, even, it's not a question of a healthcare system, family background has an effect, but it's not an effect of parallelism here. Here you're seeing some differences that emerge over the life cycle. So the question then is always the following, and this is what I raised last time. What is the source of these gaps? Something opens up early. Could it be genetic? Or is it family environments? Is it schools? What is the mechanism? And I want to talk about that mechanism. And what role, if any, is there for policy? And what should the form of policy would be? And what I want to try to convince you today is that a lot of the evidence points to an important role for family environments, above and beyond just the transmission of genes. Now, why do I mention that? Because if you look at many countries around the world, and this has a subjective content here about deteriorating environments, so it sounds very, maybe I'm a fundamentalist minister talking about the world is going to hell or something. Maybe it is. But I can tell you that the family is stressed. So this is an example in the US. Some 40 years ago in the US, there was a very famous report written by Daniel Moynihan called the Moynihan Report. And the Moynihan Report said the problem of African Americans in the United States came from the fact that the black family was falling apart. And at that point he said, you know what, the trouble is that the percentage of all kids in the African American family being raised in single parent families was around 30%. Well, now scroll forward 40 years or so after Moynihan's report, and we look at that statistic for the country as a whole, and the statistic is now close to about 27% anyway across all ethnic groups. And what we see is that the largest single growing trend is not divorce, it's not widowhood, of course, but what it is a particularly pathological state for child development, and that is the never married state. which I'll show you in a minute, at least in the United States data, is really connected with very strong, very weak parental environments. But we're not alone. If I look at, for example, the growth of lone mother families in Great Britain and compare this to 40 years ago, or almost 40 years ago, you can see a tremendous growth. And the growth is with different measures of single, separated, divorced, and widowhood. My statistics here are probably less, I'm confident this is a correct statistic, but I couldn't research it. But if you look at the percentage of children in non-traditional families in the UK as a whole, you do find a growth, a tremendous growth from 1972 to 2009. And this is true in many countries around the world. It's not just in the US. In countries like Chile, for example, in Mexico, 40 to 50% of all children are being born in single-parent families. And you say, well, so what? Then maybe it has no issue. And so again, if you were to look at where the UK stands in this framework, it's fairly high up there, and there's been a tremendous growth between 1991 even and 2005. So why do I go on about that? Because we actually have panel data on this question. And so we can actually look at the kind of home rearing environments in different types of families. And I could go through a very detailed list of these studies, and I'm not going to do it because I know that I have limited time and I want to just get to the main points. But if you were to look at measures of cognitive stimulation, how much in the interval 0 to 2, and this is just whites, no racial issue here, but I'm not controlling by education. What you do see is that the distribution, cognitive stimulation, how much do you read to the child, respond to the questions, do the kind of things that middle-class parents do routinely, that you see very serious differences among these different family types. One finding that's emerged from the literature is the intact family is a much more, it's much greater. The intact families are much more likely to produce all kinds of positive stimulation. There is an emerging literature showing that families that are broken, reattached, where one child is from one parent, the other child's from another, that they actually tend to be more like the case of the never married single mom in terms of having lower family investment than the intact families. That's the so-called blended family model. Bob Pollack has worked on that a lot. And you can get this kind of measure by different measures of disadvantage, not just looking at marital status, but marital status is a key predictor. And you can do this among white families and the like. Now what's interesting, in the US context it's particularly interesting, is that we see tremendous differences. Going back to the Moynihan report, big differences between Hispanic and black families. So this is a percentile graph where if everything were uniform at 0.1, there would be equality of distribution of material goods, but comparing the Hispanic families, black families, material goods given to children in the 0 to 3. This is now kids, black, white, and Hispanic, in intact families, which is a minority now of black families. 70 to 80% of all African American children now are not in intact families, compared to the 30% 40 years ago. But you can see the departure from uniformity. So there are very serious differences even when we adjust for things like mother's education and when we adjust for intactness, which was considered. So there are some cultural differences as well in cognitive stimulation, material goods, and emotional support. So what do we learn from all this? Well, first of all, families, and I'm going to try to convince you of this, families matter, and that there are important differences in family types, and that this difference has enormous implications for the production of capabilities and for social policy and for inequality across generations. Now, one of the arguments that's frequently made when one looks at the early emergence of gaps in skills is the genetic argument. And I know this is a sophisticated audience and I don't want to bore you with trivialities, but I think it's important just to remind you of what the modern findings are of genetics. And these are things that are out in the public domain, they're pretty well known. But we know that the simple additive gene model, gene plus environment, has been discredited for the last 20 years at least. And the whole role of epigenetics is playing a huge role. Gene-environment interactions and various kinds of interactions. So let me show you what I think is something that is quite dramatic about how the environment gets under the skin. This is something that a graph from a Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences paper some 6 years ago now, which looked at the gene expression pattern. So we know that genes by themselves do nothing. They actually transmit information, they make proteins, they kind of govern the process by which a whole variety of behaviors and developmental processes are expressed. But we ask, what is the gene expression? Here what we see is pairs of twins. On the left-hand side, 3-year-old identical twins. They're identical in terms of genetic material. And here on the right-hand side, we say 50-year-old twins. They're identical twins. They have identical DNA. They're monozygotic twins by construction. What we can actually see, though, is that when we look in the different coloration of the one pair on the left-hand side, the pair on the right-hand side, you can see these two together on the left and the right. What you can actually see is the different coloration is actually showing you how, even though they're identical twins, the expression of the genetic material differs. So we're talking about the common additive component would completely ignore this kind of difference, right? To simply say these guys are identical. But the way that the gene is operating depends on the experience that they had. Even at age 3, they're differentiated. That's what the different color is showing. And certainly by age 50, you're seeing very substantial differences. And we also have learned, and this is a very important finding, that basically the gene expression is actually triggered by child environments. So there's a very famous study, it's called into question, and I think it survived scrutiny, by Moffat, Caspi, and others, looking at some study from New Zealand. I should just give you the citation. This is the Dunedin cohort, ages 3 to 11, but now these children are into their 30s, where they were able to follow in a prospective way what actually was the outcome of various kinds of maternal or family environments. And so you could actually, they tabulated they have a number of ways to measure these, observe the families and so forth. There are substantial differences among, in terms of child maltreatment. Now, one of the findings that emerges from this literature that's extremely interesting is the following. Previous to this work, there had been in the criminology literature established a finding that individuals who had a certain genetic predisposition, a certain allele of this gene, this is low MAOA, high MAOA, those individuals who had a certain low level of this gene were much more likely to show conduct disorder, and then as you track them through life cycle, early aggressive behavior, which predicted later life cycle criminality and aggression. So there was a notion we could stop early. We could actually, we could detect who would be the potential criminals by some genetic screen. Then what Caspi and Moffat show, and I think it's a very interesting finding, is basically showing that the differential treatment, and this is shown, the red is the low MAOA, the yellow is the high level of this activity, that basically the only circumstance where this genetic propensity manifests itself is in the case where there's severe child maltreatment. So it's really an interaction of the gene and environment. It has nothing to do with the gene by itself. You can see that in the low family, the middle class families, very little evidence of this. And there are other kinds of findings of this point. The gene-environment interaction for adult inflammation. So again, the environment interacts substantially with this. But there remains an open question from this literature, and I'm not going to be able to answer this, and I think the literature doesn't answer this yet, but it's trying to. And it's going to, maybe in the long term. And that is, we don't know yet what the quantitative importance of these epigenetic interactions are. In the sense that we say we know they're there, but to what extent is the total variance of this outcome explained by these gene-environment interactions? What we do know is that they're existing, and there's a tremendous amount of work. What we've also learned from this, though, and this is an even more fascinating process and even more new and therefore less fully explored for its implications for social policy, is that the kind of dogma that was, I would now call it a dogma, that somehow Lamarckian evolution is inappropriate, is not a good description, has to be qualified, that there really is an inheritance of disadvantage across generations. And the way that this works is not just through the transfer of resources across generations, but through various RNA transcriptional factors, which actually will lead successive generations to inherit the legacy of poverty, of various forms of disadvantage. So there really is a biological mechanism which is actively being explored. I only use this information to suggest that there are important avenues for intervention which remain to be explored but are actively being explored and give a fruitful line of activity for economists working with biologists. Now, what we've also learned in this, going back to this same diagram, from a number of studies, is there evidence on critical and sensitive periods in skill development. So coming back to this diagram, the question is where in the life cycle and for what skills and for what kind of investments can we actually get maximal gain? I mean, is there something that social policy can do? Or is this all hardwired? Or what's the combination? What can we do? And we've learned a lot about this, both in developing countries and in developed countries. So in conditions of severe disadvantage, with iron deficiency, iodine, malnutrition, with various kinds of structures of poverty, where you get micronutrients in serious deficiency, you can actually substantially lower the IQ of a child by essentially depriving that child of iron. We've known that for many, many years. The same thing is true of zinc and also true of iodine. And we know that early on, unless the child gets some of these micronutrients, that some of the conditions of disadvantage can be perpetuated over the generation, over the life cycle of the child. In the less extreme cases, what we've come to understand is that the early years are very important in producing cognitive skills. And as I said earlier, there seems to be some forgiveness in the system as skills develop, as the prefrontal cortex matures, as we develop into new behaviors with maturation that give us some hope for how we might intervene in social policy. I'll show you an example of that. Now, why do I go along with this interventionist argument? Why do I think that families matter, and why do I think that environments matter? Because we have a lot of studies, some of them experimental, maybe not perfectly conducted experiments, but nonetheless experimental, where enriched early environments compensate in part for the risk features of disadvantaged environments. And so the example that I would give is the so-called Perry preschool program. I mentioned this program yesterday, and I'll just briefly summarize it today. This was a program given to disadvantaged African-American children in a suburb just west of Detroit, a town west of Detroit. This program essentially took kids 3 to 4 years of age, and it basically gives them 2.5 hours a day of a preschool program, where the program has a certain quality about it, which is not just a standard educational program. This is a program that is actually teaching the child what I would call social skills. I mean, there are names associated with this program like Piaget and Vygotsky, but the important thing is that what's happening is the kids are brought in each day and they give a task. They're given a task, and they actually help select the task. They plan the task, they execute the task, and they review the task. They're doing this 2 years in a row for 2.5 hours a day, and then there are also parental home visits. The evidence from this program and other programs show that these kinds of interventions can permanently boost life outcomes, and in that sense show that family matters. But coming back to the first theme, the theme of yesterday's talk, the main mechanism by which this program worked was not through boosting IQ. When this program was initially conceived, the main measurement system was IQ. It was cognition. So the argument was, we're going to boost the kids' IQ. So what you see here is a pattern that's fairly typical of these early preschool programs if you look only at a measure of IQ. Namely, kids are enrolled at age 3. They have an average IQ of 80. That was deliberate. Low IQ kids were brought in. Within 1 year, their IQs rise to 95, a miracle. And you can see that's one standard deviation. Then the miracle actually reverted down to what the population average was for this population, 85. And the control group has a trajectory which is quite different. Their experiment did its job early on, but by age 10, there's no difference. Yet, we actually see measures. When you do a cost-benefit analysis of this program, and we have experimental data that follow these kids into their 40s, so we have long-term follow-up. This is not just a short-term intervention. This is 40 years of data. And we're putting in a proposal to get the last, these people are now 50 years old, and we're going to try to get the data on them as well, if we can get it. What we do have measures on is personal behavior by the treatment group. And so we can actually, so personal behavior, not well defined, but it sounds good. And what it is basically is essentially the ability to get along with others and the like. And if you just look at the raw histograms, the treatment and control group substantially shifted, and you see statistically significant differences, as well as being able to get along with others and so forth. And in a study, which I won't go through in detail, but we'll just summarize, what we do is we look at the treatment effects. These are all statistically, these are all the treatment effects. I'm just showing you the results for males. There's something similar for females. If you look at the treatment effects for males, what I'm doing is decomposing the treatment effect into components due to these different factors: cognitive factors, externalizing behavior. There was some other trait that was measured early on, academic motivation, and other factors. And what this is showing, so if you look at this plot, what you see is that the principal, so this is all just, it's not giving you the absolute value of the treatment effect. It's telling you what percentage of the treatment effect is explained by the change in traits related to externalizing behavior, aggression, if you want to think of it that way, academic motivation, openness, and academic curiosity. How much, what fraction of the total treatment effect is explained by these different factors? Well, this hatched area to the right are the other factors. So we're clearly not explaining everything. It would be crazy to say we could. We only have a limited number of factors. But nonetheless, you can see that the major component of these statistically significant treatment effects essentially is due to changes in externalizing behavior. And as I say, this survives multiple hypothesis testing and several ways to control. I mean, the main ingredient, the main success story of this Perry program was in reducing crime. And even if you take a very much more agnostic view about how the randomization was performed, we still find strong effects on crime. We get similar findings, though, if you want to turn to other environments in less developed countries. Less developed countries are interesting for child development. They're less well studied. They're probably more relevant because more of the disadvantaged population in the world is living there. And so here I'll show you a little bit of that evidence. So we know that there are substantial differences. So micronutrient deprivation is not an issue in England or in the United States, but it is in countries such as even Latin American countries, parts of Colombia and Brazil, you'd find substantial nutrients, but certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. So let me just show you, and health and nutrition play very important roles. So let me just summarize briefly two studies that actually support the idea that we can do something about early child environments, and that families, or things that substitute for families, can actually improve the status of the children. So there's a Guatemalan intervention studied by Jerry Berman and a group at the World Bank, which is basically a pure nutrition. These are kids now living in severe poverty, where they're actually not given any kind of nutrients. They really are suffering micronutrient deficiencies. So it's not just total calories, it's actually the composition of the micronutrient. And so they did a treatment and control. Some people say, well, this is unethical. But they didn't know the answer when they did this. This was done some 20, 30 years ago. So the placebo group was basically Fresca, which is a Kool-Aid drink. And it's a huge study, 2,400 kids. And what was found from this study is very consistent. If you look at those who had this, there were substantial effects now. This is where you're giving people iron, supplements, and so forth. You get very high rates of return. An improvement in IQ now. Because I mentioned that one of the critical periods under severe deprivation of nutrients, you can actually reduce IQ substantially. Reading scores improve, 30 to 40% higher earnings for men, and so forth. And another study, which actually looked not only at cognitive stimulation, but nutrient stimulation in a somewhat less disadvantaged population in Jamaica, a long-term study again. These were all randomized trials, but of different nature. Some were village-wide randomizations, one village given treatment, another not. Others are individual randomizations. The Guatemalan study was comparing one village with another, but similarly situated. This is one looking at individuals. And what you're finding is stunted kids receiving nutrients and cognitive stimulation. And again, it's somewhat Perry-like. It was even shorter in some ways. Again, 2-year intervention. Again, parental intervention. And this provided some weekly play sessions, and it was fairly limited in its objective, but long-term follow-up. And what do we see? Well, compared to the non-stunted kids, the green line in this figure, if we start looking at the IQ scores now, and these are IQ scores, we actually are seeing substantial differences that appear certainly at age 18. So we're getting a persistent effect if we compare treatment to control. All these kids, however, were stunted. And so for this particular intervention, there wasn't full compensation. But yet we get very substantial effects. Impact on earnings. A lot of that earnings comes through migration, greater migration, some of them here, and motor schooling and so forth. But there's no full. So that's, I think, the lesson. We have lots of studies to talk about that, and I want to kind of summarize that. What we've also learned, and I think this is equally important in understanding the dynamics of skill formation, is that later remediation is costly and often very ineffective. So if we studied this, and I've studied this a lot in various, but a recent study, a fairly recent study by Martin and Grubb for OECD, across a range of active labor market programs that were trying to compensate for disadvantage in the adolescent years. If we do cost-benefit studies of these earlier programs, like in Perry, we get 7 to 10% per annum as a rate of return, a very high return. If you look at many of the active labor market programs, or even classroom size reductions, this is something that economists have spent a lot of time on. What happens when we reduce the classroom size? Well, a very interesting study was done on this a few years ago, where we said, okay, you get smaller classroom size, you get higher earnings, but nobody had actually evaluated what the cost was of hiring the teachers or expanding the facilities. If you do the cost-benefit analysis, the rate of return on the classroom size reduction was negative. It would have been better to just give the kids the money. Similar things for adult literacy programs, public job training programs, and the like. I did some work on public job training programs, and we actually found when we had adolescent boys and we gave them these so-called active labor market programs constituted in the American way, that we actually got a negative rate of return. It was better for them to have worked than to have gone to the job training program. But there is some evidence across a lot of studies, and this is the unfortunate part, this is the dark side of economics, if you will, that the returns are the highest for adolescents with the greatest abilities. So if we're deciding to prioritize where we should spend the money on higher education, the evidence really does support the idea that the education is, that those people who benefit the most from college and so forth are the more able. It's not the less able. That's something that people don't like. But what's good, or what at least has changed in our thinking, is that we can actually shape that ability that's so relevant for education. So one thing I skipped over last time, and I regret it now because it has been a great point to review it, so I'll just mention it. If you look at, in the United States, there's a huge issue that arises because the minorities are much less likely to attend college. Big problem. Many people, like Bill Bowen, former president of Princeton, Derek Bach, whole councils of wise people are trying to remedy this. Why are so few blacks going to college? And the policy that many Ivy League professors in particular, our presidents, adopted was basically to subsidize tuition. And this was true not just in Ivy League schools but many other places, but even when programs were given on a voluntary basis, even when tuition was given, made free, so there was no tuition cost, and we know that in the US there are huge tuition costs, still the gaps were not remedied. There were still a lot of people who didn't take it up. So Cameron and I, some years ago, actually studied this question, and we noticed that once you condition on this ability, this very ability that I was showing about, this very measure of cognitive ability, and some measures of social skills matter as well, but just focus on the cognitive ability, that blacks are actually more likely to be going to college than whites. And the same is true of Hispanics. So if anything, what you see, and the same is true of wage differentials, that ability differential is real, it's important, and that's the factor. Changing tuition had virtually no effect. And very little of the difference between black and white college going was actually related to tuition or family income. What was there was ability at age 18. And that's why I go back to the question, is it purely genetic? Well, if you take a view of genetic determinism, then that's a pretty fatalistic view about what you could never solve this problem. But what I want to argue is those very measures of ability can be created. I already showed you some interventions. I'm going to show you. So this is basically a summary of the literature. It's kind of combines two distinct ideas. But one is basically saying, what's the rate of return for a unit dollar invested, say, in these programs? These are primarily American programs. And what we can see, both as a hypothetical out of equilibrium analysis and as an empirical analysis that the rates of return targeted towards the earliest years, and now if I just idealize it, especially programs with micronutrients. So literally giving kids a drop of vitamin A in countries where there's vitamin A deprivation can literally restore sight or avoid blindness with huge lifetime costs. The rates of return on those programs are astronomical, huge policy benefits from that. You still get returns from job training, but there tends to be, just as an empirical matter, an interaction. That as you get older and older in the life cycle, the more able people are the ones who tend to benefit more. And so if you're just a strict, dismal economist sort of doing an efficiency analysis, you would say, cast aside the less able. And again, many people reject that notion. And what I want to try to show you in the rest of the lecture is there's a qualified version of that, which I want to talk about. But here what I want to do is just review and then turn to a model which summarizes the evidence and shows some evidence built directly around the model. Namely, that we have constraints that are operating out there, and these constraints have now been studied. The most important constraint, I think, is the first one. Namely, that children are stuck with their parents. It's pretty bad. You can't buy your parents. I mean, there actually is a model by Shishadri and Greenwood where children or fetuses or proto-fetuses or whatever you want to call them are in a model, a complete contingent claims model where they can insure against a bad parent. But I think that's a failure. And that's a market failure that we know doesn't exist. There's no such market for those things. So that's probably the most fundamental of all the failures. And it's very hard to set up a simple market against it. But there are ways to compete to avoid that. The other constraints are more traditional, and namely the inability of parents to borrow against child's future income, the inability of parents to borrow against their own future income. And so what we've learned, again, in terms of ability formation, in terms of dynamics of investment, is that these latter two constraints, especially the inability of parents even to borrow against their own income, is playing a huge role. And it's shaping the dynamics of investment. And when is it in the life cycle of a child when the parents are most likely to be credit constrained? It's in the early years, when the parents themselves on the early years of their life cycle trajectory. So I'll try to show you some evidence on each of these constraints. So let me just lay out, this is the same framework, and I'll skip the review of the literature and lay out a very simple model that kind of summarizes this. I don't want to go too quickly here, but just imagine a very simple overlapping generations model, one child family. There are a whole set of things. I want to put in altruism, I want to put in the notion that parents do care about their children, but it's a very simplistic model. But it still captures the essence of what I want to talk about and can let me model each of those constraints. So the individual lives 2 T periods. Mortality is exogenous here. The first T years, the child is a child, and the second T years, you're an adult. Then you die, and then you leave bequests to the previous generation. And so that's the framework. IT is investment, and children are born with initial conditions. That could be to prenatal investments. I'm not going to model that right now. So this is the framework. And here's the technology of skill formation, equation 1. Capabilities are produced by the environmental factor, the human capital of the parents, modeled by H here, theta, which is the capability at stage T, and then the investments that are made. Investments could be health investments, it could be these nutritional investments, it could be parenting, it could be a variety of things that society can do, education and the like. And so you can come back with a recursive form of this equation and literally have that capabilities are a function of the environment, the initial condition, and all previous investments. Now the key ideas here, the key idea really, but it embodies 2 distinct ideas you want to separate. One is dynamic complementarity. And so the notion of dynamic complementarity is exactly capturing this idea that investment tends to be more productive the higher the stock of skills that you start with. So that's this complementarity. That's something that we've observed. We see it in lots of different kinds of data. But there's a second aspect to this, because this is all put in an intergenerational model, or in a life cycle intergenerational model. Investment today raises the stock of skills in future periods and raises the stock of future investment. So when I do it today, invest today, I'm also boosting the stock of skills tomorrow. And that's going to be how idea 1 and idea 2 will come together to show that with evidence that the optimal policy, literally the optimal policy, at least under a certain configuration of estimated parameters for this technology of skill formation, this, there it is, equation 1, will actually show that the optimal policy is to invest in the most disadvantaged, precisely because of this dynamic complementarity. So there is a sense in which you can overcome this kind of cruel rule of throwing aside the less able. But it's important that you do it relatively early, at least if you want to make certain investments. So the idea of a critical and sensitive period, this just formalizes the obvious idea that in some periods the productivity may be higher than others. And this is just allowing for parental preferences. So let me just give you the very simplest version of the model and the constraints. So take 2 periods, stationary environment. Everything's going to be very simplistic just to get at the essence. Wages, W, interest rate, R, and we start with some initial condition. And then, basically, on reaching adulthood, parents receive a bequest B. The best B will be determined within the model. So the state variables for the parents are their own skills, the financial resources they get from the inheritance, their wage rates, the interest rates are the parameters they also face, and the initial skill level of the child. And then they choose consumption. So the budget constraint in the simplest model, unconstrained, is basically going to be C1 is the parental consumption, I1 is the investment in the first period, C2, I2, so this is a 2-period childhood, and then they pass on their bequest, their constraint of the resources. This is now from the family's point of view when they're adults. They get a wage rate W on their human capital H, so that's earnings, discounted earnings 1 period, then they die, but they start with an initial bequest B. So that's this very simple model with no credit constraint. And beta is a discount factor. So this is the problem of the parent, to maximize their own consumption. So here, this is a model in which you have purely altruistic parents, only in the sense of looking forward to the children when they're adults. So the value function here incorporates the next generation's value. And the measure of altruism is basically this delta parameter, with beta being the discount factor, the ordinary discount factor that parents have. So delta is their love of their children. So it's a very simplified model. Let everything be a scalar. And so what's the standard technology? Well, this is basically in this final form stage. The human capital of the next generation depends on the human capital of this generation, I1 and I2. So even in this perfect capital market world, the so-called traditional capital market, H plays a huge role. You're stuck with your parents. That embodies the first constraint. Now the second, so we can look at this model. What's the conventional model that guides economic policy today? A huge amount. What's in Becker and Tomes, what's in a lot of the literature, is basically that these periods are equally good in the life cycle of the child. Practically speaking, that comes down to assuming a 1-period model. It's assuming that investment's a perfect substitute. Investment in the first period, investment for the second period is a perfect substitute. So we can write this model saying that gamma is a half, that investment in period 1, investment in period 2 is basically equally productive. Now the polar opposite of this was what I'd call a Leontief technology. It's basically saying that unless you have a minimum investment in the first period, productivity in the next period is worthless. So the first one is a model where you can lock a kid in a closet and then invest in the second period and make the child whole. And in fact, that's going to be economically optimal. If that's the technology, the best thing to do is exactly that. Because you can always put the money in the bank for 1 period and then have more to invest the next period. But the Leontief technology is telling you that's not a good thing to do. So here's a very sparse, very simple case where this parameter now is saying, literally, if I invest nothing in the first period, so I have this raging animal that I've locked up in a closet for the last 6 years, that there's literally nothing I can do in the second period. The question is, which is closer to the actual fact? And in fact, the second case, even though the first case governs a lot of the thinking in the literature, it's a second case that comes closer. It's not quite Leontief, but you can actually estimate some version. So here you go from one extreme, perfect substitutes, to perfect complements. So nobody will be shocked that if you want to try to find the intermediate course, you look at a CES. So that would be, phi would be related to the elasticity, it would be the substitution parameter. And gamma would be the skill multiplier, showing how much you weight one period with another. So let me just explain that, I've just explained this, that obviously the optimal policy under perfect substitutes would be to invest in the early period, the late period. always a late period, because I can always compensate, right? And I can make more money doing it. So I'll skip that triviality and say perfect complementarity, under the assumption that I put equal weights in I1 and I2, would say you should, under all circumstances, invest equally in both periods. The halfway house is going to be something that looks like this. If I look at the ratio of early investments to late investments, it's going to depend on this parameter gamma, which is basically showing me how much the relative productivity is of early relative to late, holding constant the substitution parameter, and then the substitution parameter itself, and of course the interest rate. So let me just show you a figure which actually puts this all very simply. And it says what the optimal policy would be. So the Leontief case, where things are perfect, right shoe, left shoe case, if you want to think of it that way, perfect complements, would be this blue line, and basically would lead to equal investment no matter what. Let me assume the interest rate is 0 to just simplify the calculation. But now as we move to different cases, from where the elasticity of substitution moves from basically like the Cobb-Douglas case as an intermediate case, the red case, and you're getting more and more perfect substitutes, literally the perfect substitute case would actually be right angle. It would look like a right angle. It would just hook up. And so the question is, what would be the finding? Well, if the skill multiplier is above a half, suggesting there's some early advantage, then depending on the degree of complementarity, we'd like to know what's the ratio of early to late investment. How much more early investment should there be relative to late investment on a pure social planner optimal program design? So these two parameters play a key role, and I want to show you some evidence on what these parameters are empirically, at least from the US. I should point out, though, that what I'm going to show you is basically that the parameters are favoring much more the gamma greater than half case and the case where you get something closer to Leontief. It's probably something like this green line that I'm showing here. So it's suggesting that early investments are important relative to late investments, and that social policy is actually weighted much more towards late investments rather than early investments. So this is the difference between prevention and early treatment of the problem, just remediating the problem at the get-go, rather than. So if we basically just prevent the problem from happening in the first place, we actually get much higher returns than if we try to solve the problem. So I gave you a very striking example where rates of return on many of the adolescent intervention programs targeted towards cognition, towards disadvantaged youth, have very low returns. So let me just briefly look at the other environments. So if I have an environment, other credit constrained environments, where B prime, where the, again, you can't borrow against the child's future earnings, and you want to leave a positive bequest, therefore, that basically, in this particularly simple model, investment's going to be constrained, both early and late, but maybe it's obvious, because the constraint is operating only across generations, not within time periods, that basically the ratio of optimal investment, even though it's below the optimal level early and late, the optimal ratio is not affected. So you're getting the right proportion, it's just the wrong magnitude. If the parents themselves face lifetime liquidity constraints, so let me give you an example where basically each period now the family has to live within these constraints. So the family gets the budget from the previous generation, that's B, it has its earnings, WH, within that period, then there's consumption and investment, and then there's a certain amount of savings that it can carry forward. So if these constraints are binding, so it can't go into negative debt, has to be non-negative, and the bequest that it leaves behind to the kid. It can't leave the kid a huge mortgage to pay off. In that case, if there's any life cycle wage growth, as we think there is, and alpha here is a factor in the second period in which wages are growing, so that's the typical profile, that basically you get the optimal policy if I write down a traditional class of power utility functions, maybe you don't recognize this since I went over it fairly closely, but this first term was what I gave you in the perfect credit market case. This is a factor that actually distorts, for I think intuitive reasons, the ratio of early to late investment, simply because funds are scarce in the early period. But that's governed by the ratio of lambda, which is the intertemporal substitution. So if lambda is equal to 1, which is that parents are perfectly patient, right? So that you basically have the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is infinite. Then obviously the second factor goes away, and I'm back to the case that I had before. What's relevant is lambda relative to phi, and there's a tug of war there. And based on evidence that I'm going to show you in a minute, we have some evidence that that lambda, that the elasticity here, the phi, the phi in this estimate here is close to minus 0.2, minus 2, sorry. And from Attanasio and Browning, we actually estimate that lambda is actually in the interval, it's substantially negative. So it's giving us a number that suggests, if I can get the slide, that this ratio, the exponent, is in the range of 0.83 to 1.33. So there is definitely a downward bias here and a tilt towards, from all the empirical evidence, towards underinvestment early on. So here I wanted to show you what the estimates are. And let me just briefly summarize. I realize that I think I have, 5 or 10 minutes, so let me just summarize this quickly. But there are some major challenges, and let me just summarize what they are. So what we're going to do, and what I've done in some work with Cunha and Shanak, and then Cunha alone, is actually try to estimate these models on data. And the problem is we have very rich longitudinal data sets. There are serious econometric challenges. There's a multiplicity of measured inputs and outputs. There's measurement error in inputs and outputs. There's endogeneity of investments, and there are a bunch of emitted inputs. And the crucial thing, though, from the most important thing in terms of this diagram that I gave you earlier, was that most of the work that's been done in the past has assumed linear technologies. So basically assuming that investment can perfectly substitute over a range. So Todd and Wolpen, most of the studies done on this study. And the crucial thing here is, of course, the nonlinearity, to see how substitutable investments are for early disadvantage. How much can we compensate? And there's a second point I would make as well, which is important, is that virtually the whole literature is lived on test scores. And I think a test score is meaningless. Even though I put some up, I would actually now argue they are meaningless, because any monotonic function of a test score is a test score. And that's why the value-added analysis, I think, is a complete waste of time. But we settle that question too, because we anchor all of these unobserved latent factors, and that's what they are, in some real measure of outcome, like earnings, education, and so forth. So we get away from the psychometric problems. So this is basically the idea. So I'm just going to be quick, but I'm going to at least try to summarize. Basically what we have is we have skills, investments, and parental background. We have lots and lots of measurements on these things. So if you're into, there's a certain approach that says, well, let's use the available data. Here you would be swallowed whole by the original data, because you have literally hundreds of measurements. There's no shortage of measurements on these factors. There's a lot of measurement error on each one of these factors. I'll show you quickly how important the measurement error is. So forming arbitrary indices of these things can be even though traditional in this literature, can be very dangerous. And it is dangerous. It does affect the estimates. So we have lots of measures on children's investments at each stage, what families are doing, skills, and then on parental background. And so what we want to do is estimate simultaneously. This is like a state space model. Here's the equation of motion, the technology of skill formation, where we have latent variables, theta t, I t, h t, and we're actually estimating that, and that's a nonlinear technology. And we anchor the scales of theta in real behavior. So it's not just a test score. So that's the traditional specification is linear, and we're going to go into a nonlinear specification. So what's the source of identification? Very briefly. First of all, just from the factor structure model itself, and from a series of covariance restrictions and dynamic covariance restrictions, you can get identifiability. And in addition, there are innovations to family income and other shocks to family resources. So from two different sources, more of a traditional IV approach, and we use quantile IV methods here, as well as non-parametric factor structure. So all of this, I should just point out for the econometricians in the room that all of these, in the paper with Shanak, equations with the starred and the double star equations, that the equations for measurement don't have to be parametric linear equations. There's no normality. Those are non-parametric equations, as well as the equation of motion. Those can both be non-parametric. So we do allow for a very general technology. Okay, So let me just show you, so we have this. So these are age, so let me just summarize the main model. So the technology of skill formation is not, even though I just said could be non-parametric, it's not. It's a CES, a sequence of CES models. And we can estimate then share parameters, elasticities of substitution at each stage of the life cycle. And what are the main findings? Without getting into too many details, the self-productivity, namely how skills stay over, the persistence of skill gets stronger. It's particularly striking in cognition. By age 10, the rank stability, remember it's just because the score itself doesn't mean anything, but the rank stability of IQ gets very stable. Between 10 to 12, from that point on, it's very difficult to change IQ. For non-cognitive skills, it's a little bit social skills, there's more flexibility, more malleability. So that in terms of the notation of complementarity and substitution, complementarity between cognitive skills and investments becomes stronger as children get older. And this is the elasticity of substitution I talked about at the later periods. Complementarity between cognitive and non-cognitive skills becomes slightly weaker. So it's actually slightly easier to compensate at later ages for non-cognitive skills. But remember the dynamics of this process. I'm rushing over something that's not trivial. You give kids initial investments in health, cognitive and non-cognitive skills, they're cross effects, very strong cross effects. So early measures of personality boost the acquisition of cognitive skills. So you actually see cross effects as well as dynamic complementarity and own effects. So it's a fairly rich dynamics. And so we can actually explain, not everything by any means, but we can explain 30%, 40% of educational attainment by these cognitive and non-cognitive capabilities alone. So let me just interpret the estimates very briefly. So we have this estimated model. I could go through in great detail. If you want me to, I can. I had to put up another slide. But let me just stay with just an interpretation, just to show generally what's going on here and why I think it's important. So let me consider a social planner's problem. This is kind of like Plato's Republic, where basically what I'm doing is I'm putting resources into kids. Parents are neutralized. So I'm assuming no feedback. I mean, there's a real non-trivial question, right? If I put resources into one kid, maybe the parents will compensate and not invest in the other kid. I'm going to abstract from that in this simulation, because I don't think we have a good estimate of that yet, although there are some recent studies. We have a bunch of children. I'm going to simulate from the distributions that are estimated off of this model. So this is basically a simulation study of what the implications of the estimates are. So the goal of the social planner, say, is to maximize per capita schooling. So we want to actualize per capita schooling in the economy, and we have a fixed amount of resources, 2 units in the 2 periods of the child's life. And this is the estimated technology. So cognitive, non-cognitive skills, parental background, as well as unobserved shocks. I was cavalier about them, but we aren't in the paper. So basically, this is basically what we find. If we construct the optimal policy, and this is where the good news is out there for the world of investment. Remember I gave you this dismal, the dismal profession, or whatever you want to call us ourselves, you know, the dismal messages that economists frequently give. This is a very optimistic message. So what this is showing is the optimal early and late investment by child initial conditions. And so if we look at this slide here on the left, this is the child initial conditions. Now, this is a very busy slide, but as you go from 1 to -1, what you're doing is you're going to more and more disadvantaged kids, okay? And the same thing here. This is initial endowment of cognitive skill, and this is initial endowment of non-cognitive skill. The light area shows where optimal investment should be the greatest. And so it's saying, exactly as I was promising, that the dynamic complementarity would suggest that the early investments, the greatest fraction of early investments should occur in the most disadvantaged, especially those kids with low levels of non-cognitive, of cognitive skills, okay? And as you get to the darker and darker areas, you're getting less advantage. The graph is a little hard to read. If you go to the second period, the curvature changes a bit, okay? That's the dark side of all this. So another way to see it is to basically say, if we look at, this is another way to see it in terms of just the ratio of early to late investments, that basically it's saying that if you look at child initial skill, the light is suggesting that the socially optimal policy from the point of view of maximizing aggregate schooling is also what some people would argue strictly on political grounds give resources to the disadvantaged. So in that sense, there's a tremendous agreement in these kinds of policies. Let me just show you how this plays out. And this is a way to summarize what I'm doing. I realize I'm a little bit over time, so I'll let the chair call me out of order at any point from now on. But let me conclude with this, and I can show you some more very interesting slides, but I'm also willing to stop. But this kind of demonstrates a couple of points of the work. So there's a lot of work here that goes into this. So we're looking now, I gave you a simulation for aggregate education. Crime is another output of great interest. And as I mentioned, the Perry preschool program had huge effects on crime, especially for boys, who are major sources of crime in society. But the point is that this graph is actually showing what the optimal targeted intervention would be. So remember, I'm the social planner. I'm looking down on these families. I see kids who are advantaged and disadvantaged. I can then target what the investment should be. And so I can literally compute the early to late investment. We've already seen that you're going to target more absolute resources and more relative resources towards the disadvantaged kids. But now there's a distribution, because disadvantage is not a uniform condition. It's not like there's some cutoff. And so this blue curve suggests that for most of the population, the early investment should be greater than the later investment. The data show just the opposite, that if you start looking at conditions of child poverty and disadvantage, it's moving just the opposite. Now you'll notice that if I do the same kind of calculation for crime, that actually, even though the majority of the distribution, the median is certainly to the right of 1, there's still a shift of the distribution to the left. And why is that going on? Well, that takes me back to the theme of yesterday, which is saying crime, remember, is caused not just by cognitive factors, but by non-cognitive factors. And so another important dimension of social policy, which we're just beginning to fully understand, is that if we really want to think about, so we still would invest early relative to late, but relatively less if our only goal was crime. Now obviously if we had another criterion like maximizing GDP or something of the sort, that'd be yet a third graph here. So yes, individually tailored policies, but crime is much more heavily weighted on these non-cognitive factors. And precisely because there's more substitutability, more possibility for intervention and remediation in the later years, those social interventions can be effective. And that's an avenue that's just really beginning to be fully explored. But what it's not is teaching the kids how to read and write so much as teaching them basic social skills and behavior. And in fact, there is some evidence that such work. So basically, timing and interventions matter. Now, I don't know if you want an economic, I don't know if people are completely on board with this or you want some economic intuition as to why. I mean, this is somewhat bizarre. I gave you estimates that suggested period by period the technology showed complementarity. And yet this is showing something which is not looking like complementary. That complementarity, just taken at face value in a single period model, would say invest in the most advantaged, right? And yet what I'm saying is no, you should invest in the most disadvantaged early on. Why does that work? Well, the simple intuition is precisely that at least in the cognitive component, what we're finding, and that's still a major component, we're finding less and less ability to remediate in later ages. And so for precisely that reason, even though there's a dynamic of complementarity, precisely to avoid having to spend money on remediation later on in the life cycle, you should invest early on. So I'll skip the intuitive example, which maybe isn't so intuitive. And let me just conclude with one thing about education policy, unless you want me to stop. Okay, fine, perfect. I'll stop in 5 minutes, I promise you. But this is British data, and you should like this. So, I mean, this really is. This other was American data because we have some, this has yet to be estimated on British data. But the question is, what does this tell us about schooling and education policy? Most economists think about human capital and capability formation as something that's actually a consequence of schools. That we do this at the schools. What I'm trying to suggest is that families are playing a very important role. Families are under attack. Families are a major source of disadvantage in the modern society. And so we really need to think about the skill production beginning long before this. So, before family. So let me just show you a couple of things. First, what we've learned, and this is something that even takes us back, well, let me show you one step at a time. So I showed you yesterday that these non-cognitive traits were very predictive, and cognitive traits of who goes to school. But schooling itself has an effect So here we have a causal estimates from, this is this paper with Itzua, Stiegsrud, and myself, that we can actually look at various components of the ASVAB, the components of the Armed Forces Qualifying Test, how additional years of school boost the measures of cognition. So we see very strong effects, paragraph comprehension, math knowledge, and the like. We also see, especially for things like locus of control, how well you can govern your own life, self-esteem, maybe less important, still considered important, we can see that the high school years are playing a huge effect in causally determining these traits. So it isn't just that these traits determine schooling, these traits also, in addition, compute and determine outcomes. And so this actually takes me to a point which I can't resist making, because I know this is still in public policy discussion in Britain today, and that's the signaling debate. Remember, there was a notion about whether schooling was effective. So years ago, Spence wrote this, a lot of people were writing. I'm told that Alison Wolfe still writes about this and promotes signaling as the main source of education. So the question that was posed was, is schooling an effective strategy for alleviating policy? Or basically, is just schooling showing what the consequences are for signals of ability? Well, if you remember, the way the debate was framed was ability was just given. It was a God-given thing. It came from the genetics. And what we've seen is that families and early environments and a variety of interventions can actually affect and create abilities. So let me show you, and this is British data. This is from the BCS 1970. And this is work with Gabriella Conti and Sergio Itzua. This shows you, in a very simple way, disparities by education. This is also looking at health and criminal activity, so you go to the left, you'll see differences for males and females. The level of education here is just going beyond minimum schooling age, so this is really the lowest level of going on. And what you see is substantial differences. These are just the raw differences. This is just the mean difference between those who go on beyond minimum qualifications and those who don't. And this is a huge thing. This is the log hourly wage, pretty substantial difference, differences by gender. And you go across health behaviors and then arrest before. Now what we do, and this could be another whole presentation, I'll just summarize it, is we ask what fraction of those gaps is due to the educational component and what fraction of those gaps is actually due to early life conditions prior to entering school. And so what you can see is, yes, there's some merit here for the signaling debate. About 2/3 actually of this wage gap, for this particular wage gap, is actually due to factors that are preschool factors. There still is a causal effect. So the causal effect, these are average treatment effects, and they're actually quite close to treatment on the treated because there doesn't seem to be that much foresight of individuals about returns, but that's another whole story. The fact is there is a big causal component. It varies across outcomes, but looking just at the wage component, you see a substantial component. But this causes us to rethink what's going on. Yes, the early factors are important. They're affecting who goes to school, right? And they're also affecting the returns that come given that you go to school, but schooling also has a role to play. And we can actually see who benefits and who loses, but I surely have run out of time. And there's similar evidence from the US, and I would just simply point out that you get now across progressive levels, and we have similar data for the UK if I can find it. Yeah, this is at higher education, A levels and O levels, the causal effect and the selection components. And you get similar results for the US. So let me just conclude. So I've shortly run out of time. So let me summarize the lectures. Inequality has many dimensions. Not all inequalities, I said in the first day, if you look at Piketty and Saez and look at a lot of the variation across countries, not all inequality is produced by inequality in skills. Market institutions play an important role, hence the differential behavior of the evolution of inequality in France versus the US and the UK versus the US. But still, inequality in skills plays an important role. Skills are multidimensional, and they produce inequality in a variety of outcomes. So the notion here is not just to look at health, not just to look at wages, but to look at these low-dimensional traits that actually produce outcomes over the life cycle. And I tried to motivate that the gap, the link that I'd like to make between these low-dimensional capabilities and outcomes, saying directly as preference parameters, has yet to be made with any exactitude. There's some relationship between the preference parameters I've used, time preference, social preferences that we see in economics. I think understanding the origins of skills is essential in understanding inequality. The skill gaps open up early, but they're not purely genetic. They're critical and sensitive periods, and that economic and social policy should recognize the dynamics of this. But I think another important component, and this is probably, I don't know if it's politically correct or not in Britain, I'm so removed from the situation, I can't tell you, let people howl or not, but the family plays a very important role, and it's huge, and it's something that has to be acknowledged, and family plays a much more important role. Even for schooling outcomes, we know that successful families, supporting families, play an important role. And so progress in the economics of the family and understanding how these skills are created, I think, is going to be important for our understanding inequality. So I showed you how we formalized it. What I haven't said in these lectures, and we're actively doing research on this, is actually looking at the biological foundations, looking at the interactions between cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And so I think we broadens our understanding about policy, and I would say that the true measure of child poverty is not the kind of traditional measure people talk about. It's really a measure of the quality of parenting, these resources available in early life. And so the hope is, and this is why I said at the very beginning, that there's still a lot of gaps to fill out in this diagram to really understand the importance of these traits and the like. But progress is being made, and I think we're going to really have a much finer understanding in the next decade or so of really understanding the dynamics of the skill formation progress, the critical and sensitive periods, and what an optimal social policy would look like. And I think it changes a lot of our traditional thinking about signaling, about IQ, about the importance of the family, and about the relative importance of schools relative to family. So thank you very much for your patience and interest.